Even though 1st and 2nd Kings are not part of the focus of this introductory class, it is helpful to get some perspective on those books because a lot of what goes on in them is a background to what happens in Isaiah and Jeremiah, particularly as it relates to the prophetic office. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings are organized around what we call regnal formulas. These are the reigns of each of the kings, what they did, and how they are evaluated, and this structures these books. For Judah, the date of that the king took the throne relative to the reign of the king of Israel is the way each king is introduced. Remember, there are no absolute dates, and so one can only date things by the reign of such and such a person. The introduction to a Judahite king also mentions the age at which he came to the throne and the duration of his reign. The name of the mother of the king is mentioned, and then there is a value judgment of the king relative to King David. This is followed by, now the rest of the acts, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? This is a work we no longer have. It was probably sort of court records that were kept. And there is a concluding statement that he slept with his ancestors, and so reigned in his stead. For Israelite kings, it starts with the date the king took the throne relative to the reign of the king of Judah, the location of the capital city of Israel, because this changes during the northern kingdom. You have the mention of the length of the reign of the king, and always a negative evaluation of the king. As with the regnal formula for Judah, it mentions, now the rest of the acts, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And there is a concluding statement that he slept with his ancestors, and so reigned in his stead. The overall perspective of these books, which is thought to derive from a Deuteronomic school, has the perspective that the king should be evaluated primarily on his faithfulness to Yahweh, not only personally, but in regard to actions taken to promote the sole worship of Yahweh, and in regard to worship in Jerusalem, because the Israelite kings are not conducting worship in Jerusalem, but instead set up alternate sanctuaries in the northern kingdom. The Israelite kings are always found wanting. You can see here the relative size and major cities of the southern and northern kingdoms. Notice that the kingdom of Israel includes Samaria, Jerash, Shechem, Jaffa, Beit El, Jericho. The southern kingdom, Jerusalem, Lachish, Hebron, Beersheba. And the northern kingdom tends to be larger in territory, which makes sense since there are more tribes that break away than stay with Judah. After the division of the kingdom, which of course we saw in an earlier lecture, there are about 4 decades of hostilities between the kingdoms, and this has to do with where is the border going to be, who is going to control what territory. Early in the division of the kingdom, we have an invasion by a pharaoh called Shushak. He belonged to the 22nd dynasty of Egypt, and this is in the 5th year of the reigns of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Shushak has been identified with a pharaoh called Shushak the First, which would place him in about the mid to late 10th century. Not everybody is certain of this. Rehoboam offers no resistance, and he basically gives away the temple treasury in order to avoid being destroyed by Egypt. Shushak therefore concentrated on the northern kingdom, specifically the city of Megiddo. However, the invasion seems to have had no lasting impact. In the north, there is the rise of the house of Omri, which lasted 4 decades. And this followed a period of instability in the north, at the end of which Zimri, commander of half the chariots, killed Baasha, king of Israel, and so Israel made Omri, who was commander of the king over Israel. And then there's relative stability for a while. We don't know that much about Omri, but he did purchase the hill of Samaria, and he built a new capital there. During Omri's dynasty, Israel and Judah were in close alliance. It's a time of prosperity, relative power. North and South were partially reintegrated. Just want to mention here, this is a picture of a reconstructed monumental inscription that was found in Jordan in the 19th century called the Mesha stele. And it would have been commissioned by the king of Moab, Mesha, who we see mentioned in the Bible. And in it, he recounts some victories over the house of Omri. Omri and his dynasty had been able to control parts of Moab, and this recounts Moab's success in throwing off the rule of the northern kingdom. In typical military rhetoric, Mesha claims that Israel is no more because Mesha destroyed Israel. But this is sort of typically what we find in monumental inscriptions that commemorate battles. After this period, after the decline of the deaths of Ahab, king of Israel, and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, there is a decline of both kingdoms. Omri's dynasty ended in 843 with the massacre of both royal families, who are now related by marriage. This happens because of the rise of Jehu, who is not of a royal family. He massacred 70 members of the royal family and seized the throne. And in the battle, he also shoots King Ahaziah of Judah, who dies at Megiddo. Jehu had been basically designated through one of the sons of the prophets to be the next king of Israel. However, it's interesting to note that the book of Hosea views Jehu's acts with disapproval. We've seen the mention of the city of Megiddo a few times. And Megiddo, Ahaziah dies there. Later, Josiah will die in battles against an Egyptian pharaoh. And Megiddo is important for sort of a lasting tradition that we see extending into the New Testament. Megiddo was a city that stood sort of at the intersection of two major roads. One was the major trading route between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and it's also along the route between the Phoenician cities and the Jordan River Valley. It shows up in the New Testament as Armageddon because the name of Megiddo is actually Har Megiddo, the mountain or the hill of Megiddo. In the New Testament, it's called Armageddon. That's sort of a Greek form of it. And it is said to be the site of future battles in Revelation that will finally determine the reign of God and the forces of God's people. And Megiddo has this sort of distinction as the place where this will be decided because of its strategic importance at the intersection of these two major roads.